initiative to spread free CLAT training resources to increase and facilitate greater access to those who are preparing for the CLAT exam. I'm extremely pleased to introduce our guest for today, who will be dealing with how to prepare for logical and legal reasoning for CLAT. A short introduction: Debajyoti Das graduated from HNLU Raipur, and in the 2006 edition of the NLS examination, he was All India Rank 20, but elected to do his own thing at HNLU. He's also received the very prestigious Microsoft Intellectual Property Scholarship in 2009 and has been an active participant in multiple Moot code competitions, both national and international, that I'm sure he'll be happy to talk to you about. He worked at the law firm Amarchand Mangaldas and specialized in the field of capital markets. And he set up Legal Sapiens, which is a training institute for training law students that he founded in 2018. So I think without further ado, we'd like to hand over the stage to Debajyoti. Welcome. How are you doing?
Thank you. Very good. I mean, as well as anybody can do in the middle of the Corona thing, but yeah, otherwise good.
I can imagine that it's taking a toll on everyone, but it gives us the opportunity to have an audience for these webinars, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions for you. So let's dive straight into the heart of the matter. How important do you feel both the logical and legal reasoning sections are?
Well, let me start by saying I think all sections are equally important because a lot of the sections are, something like, for example, maths. I know that's not part of the main presentation that I have to make, but what I'm saying is that, for instance, it's an area which a lot of people tend to start ignoring. So I don't want to start by saying legal is extremely important or logic is extremely important and thereby imply that you can take a little more liberties with a section like math. So I think all sections are extremely important because every mark is important. Now that the paper is, for those of you who are a little uninitiated on the matter, the CLAT pattern has been structurally changed to a very large extent. So now it's not 200 questions as it earlier was when you gave the paper, or some ancient time when I gave the paper.
Right.
But it's 150 marks, which means the value of each mark is obviously proportionally gone up higher, and the closeness in terms of cutoffs, etc., is going to be so. So logic, legal, both are extremely important sections. Now, legal in particular is a little more important than other sections for two reasons, I believe. One is it has 25% weightage, so there's a huge chunk of the paper which is still legal reasoning as it was earlier. And B, in case of cutoff, and it's a rare situation, but in case of the same marks that two people score on the CLAT paper, the ultimate tie break is decided on the basis of legal. Now, it might not matter to probably 99% of the people, but ask that to someone who had rank 57 maybe, or 55 now the general category seats in NLS, and on tiebreak got 56 and waiting list one never cleared and therefore had to join another college altogether. For that one person, and you don't want to be that one unfortunate person who missed out on it. So that's why I think legal has a little slightly more important area than others. Now, logical reasoning is uniquely important for a completely different reason. Because logical reasoning has both critical reasoning, which is English based, and analytical reasoning, which is maths based. So while it might seem to a lot of people that logical reasoning is just English oriented, it's actually not. There's quite a bit of maths involved in parts, especially parts of analytical reasoning. So it'll help you kickstart your preparation process and assist you in your overall basics of maths, etc., or at least gently keep on reminding you that maths is also a section which you should not ignore, which, as I said earlier, there is no section which can be ignored because there is no mark which is less important than the other. So that's why.
I think that's an extremely valuable insight, because I remember when I was doing some of the questions for logical reasoning, it translated to me being able to perform better in the math section as well.
Right.
And for our year's paper, at least in 2011, the English section and the critical reasoning section were quite interchangeable because of the amount of reading heavy
I
Uh,
remember. I remember it. I think it's a good benchmark for everyone to understand how sometimes. So I always give people two CLAT paper examples. So 2011 paper would be a good one of the best examples I think of all time to understand that if anyhow you manage to ignore English or English was not your strong area, then you might as well not give that paper because you're never going to be able to even go through probably about 70% of the paper, which means you're going to get nowhere close to Padmini's 173, which is an insane score, by the way, and congratulations.
Thank you. It was many
Um,
decades ago.
yeah, but I mean, you get the idea. And then I give everybody the example of the 2015 paper, where if for instance, if you decided that you can probably take a little load off the math section, then there's absolutely no point giving that paper in 2015 because it was heavily maths focused. I think the logical reasoning section was so brutally dominated by the maths areas that I think 35 out of 40 questions were maths based, and on top of it, that's 20 marks of the math section anyway. So that's about more than 25% of the paper, more than 50 marks out of 200 were actually maths based. So don't take that risk. You may have a stronger section, but you can't have a weak section. Is the way to look at it, I think.
Hmm. And I remember, let's dive into logical reasoning for the first half of
Sure,
this talk. I
sure.
remember when I was preparing for CLAT, it was two buckets of logical reasoning. You had your analytical reasoning questions and your critical reasoning questions. Do you think
Yes.
that bucketing is still valid, or has the line gotten more blurry over the years?
So I think that over the years, it's not really changed much, but I don't know how much of a substantial change is going to happen this year. Now, the CLAT has already come out with a few sample papers,
Right.
but well, might as well say it on record. I've gotten into the habit of not trusting the CLAT committee, so to say, in terms of the sample paper. So even this year, for example, now I'll give you a legal reasoning example, but you get the point. So, for instance, this year when they came out with the first sample paper, they said, as usual, they said you don't have to have prior legal knowledge. But I think it's so deceptive, and it's been deceptive for 2 decades now, at least, more way before since I remember also. So they said no legal knowledge required, no prior legal knowledge, and that's the whole point why we're changing the pattern. It's going to be not even principal facts; it's going to be reading comprehension based. And then if you look at the GK section, so neither logical, not even legal section. In the GK section, they had a passage on Trump's whole impeachment fiasco that was going on at that time. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's still an ongoing drama, but it's unfolded to a large extent. At that time, it was still unfolding.
Mm.
So while it was unfolding, there a whole passage on that. And one of the questions in that Trump impeachment passage is, which article of the Constitution of India
Mm-hmm.
deals with impeachment proceedings for the President of India?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the CLAT committee actually expects students to know that answer without having prior legal knowledge, I I don't know if I can really put an adjective to it without using unparliamentary language, because that's insane. How do you remember constitution article numbers and expect somebody to know that without reading constitution ever? Or
Mm.
so has the pattern changed structurally? They're saying yes, now there's going to be RC. Has the bucketing of analytical and critical reasoning changed? I don't think so. I think it's going to be more critical reasoning dominated this time, because all the sample papers have consistently uh, at least reflected that. Now, at the same time, they're definitely not saying that analytical reasoning is going to become zero. Now, the math section anyway looks more like analytical reasoning this time.
Yeah.
So, which means in terms of how you approach logical reasoning, I think the preparatory background that you need to go through is pretty much going to remain constant. So the basis for number system and ratio proportions, the basics of it, you still have to make sure, but how you apply it is now going to be based on graphs and tables and charts and so on. So it's not exactly how we used to do analytical reasoning per se, but so arrangements and calendars continue. And now
Calendar.
it's more data interpretation and so on in the math section.
Mm.
So I mean, the confluence is just easier to understand now, and the what is it? The pigeonholing was easier to understand earlier. So same, I think, goes for legal and GK. It's just so seamlessly, like how you said in your time, the English and CR sections were just pretty much interchangeable. I think the same applies now for maths and analytical reasoning, as well as GK and legal reasoning, both those areas.
So what is analytical reasoning?
Oh, what is analytical reasoning? Well, so most of the questions that we have historically faced in the CLAT papers are primarily based on like people sitting around, or something that you can actually do either by a graphical representation also, although we never had graphs. So you'll get a passage form of a paragraph kind of a question. Primarily, like I said, so there's most popular areas are seating arrangements, family trees, and calendars, right? So in and around those. So what I mean by, let me just quickly elaborate on all of these three popular examples. And I'm not saying it's limited to it. I'm just saying
there's been
popular.
A propensity.
So yeah. So calendars, for example, if today is this day and that day and that day, or if you know how we have if this month at this day is this, and this person met this person on that day, and then somebody else met this person. So you have to logically keep on connecting all of those dates, and then finally somebody will ask you, okay, when did you think B met D actually, or ate rice on which day, and so on. Arrangements would be somebody sitting in a circle, or even if they're sitting in a row, then B is sitting next to C, and C is in the middle of E and F, and so on. So again, you sort of break it down into the various components and try to derive who's actually sitting next to who, and so on and so forth. Somehow there's never a question on Katrina sitting next to Debajyoti, but you know, I've come to live with it without that reality. And then of course there's family arrangements as well. So if A is B's brother's sister's daughter, and then so and C is grandfather of D, only one of them is out of C and D are male. So again, so you have to derive. Now we have had unconventional questions in terms of the language of the question, but I think if you're clear on these three and how you practice and derive these kind of questions, you'll be able to. So I remember there was a question on employment, like A is a clerk, and B is a assistant, and somebody is a manager, like in a banking structure. And only one of them is somebody was a neighbor of somebody, and so again you can derive the same the answer for the question based on how you anyway used to solve say the arrangement questions or the family tree questions, and so on. So it's the same skill set required. It's just transferable in terms of how you same logic. It would be more appropriate actually, because logical reasoning section. So yeah.
So
I'm sorry, I'm using it on the phone. So if there's a lot of messages coming, I'm not going to be, I don't know if I'm keeping track of any messages. So would you be kind enough to
I'll
let
read
me
out
know?
any questions to you. Also, if anyone has questions at any point of time from either that you want either of us to address, please drop the questions in the chat section. We'll get back to you as soon as we end the main substantive part of this conversation. We have a couple of questions streaming in, but like we'll get to those eventually.
Okay.
कुछ सवाल है तो please chat में drop कीजिए. My Hindi is a little weak because I'm from Assam, but I try.
No problem.
So I think I'm speaking only for myself, but analytical reasoning was a little bit easier for me to figure out when I started preparing, because it was quite technical. You could, for the relationship questions, you could just think about your Taujis, Masajis, Masijis, whatever was going on, and you would arrive at an answer that could be somewhat accurate. And for the making the correlations between somebody's wearing a red shirt sitting next to a pink shirt, that kind of question, you could sketch it out and sort of apply your brain and you would arrive at an answer. But when we move to the critical reasoning section, it becomes a lot more abstract, and more than one answer starts looking like the right answer, especially in those what strengthens the argument most. So it's almost like a subjective element there, because you might think this is the most strong argument, but the CLAT committee might think something else is. So
I completely
agree.
What
are your thoughts?
So first of all, let me start by saying it's pretty much what I say when I take an introductory session for students to tell them how they can approach say logical reasoning also. So for instance, again, logical reasoning and maths, the analytical reasoning and maths part of it, I always say, this is one area where you're guaranteed to get the right answer. It's not going to be abstract. It's not going to be something that is dependent on my opinion or how I feel or my life experience. This is not going to matter. It's 1 + 1 is 2. It's an objectively derivable conclusion. The same applies for analytical reasoning. Once you crack the code, you're just going to get the right answer. At the same time, you're absolutely right. Logical reasoning, as well as legal reasoning to a large extent, unless there's a pre-decided case law on the point, it's definitely more subjective in nature. Now, for instance, in GMAT or even at CAT level also, which is the exam for IIMs and business schools, for those of you who may want to explore it, it gets even more abstract sometimes, because you want to also draw a distinction between what is an inference and what is a conclusion. For the life of me, even I have not come to a conclusion, so to say, as to if I can already infer something, why would that not be a conclusion? I know there's a difference between the two, because my teachers have told me and I tell my students, and there's an acceptable concept of what that distinction is. But I think those are things that you anyway have to unlearn by the time you actually go to law school. I think you need to know that if you're inferring something, that's basically what you're going to argue in front of a Supreme Court or High Court judge also. This is derivable. Derivable but not necessary is I think the key distinction that people need to keep in mind. So similarly, in the example that you gave about strengthening or more strengthening and so on, again, that's the distinction that works in somebody's mind, or can work. Is that the only way to approach it? Actually, is it one of the possible conclusions? Can you derive it? Even if the answer is yes, it's still a possible inference. But if it's a guaranteed necessary kind of derivation that arises from a certain situation, like I'll give you an example. So let's say something like demonetization has happened right now. Because of demonetization, obviously people went and deposited their money in their respective bank accounts. Now, I mean, people committed fraud and 500 other things happened, but let's look at the simpler realities, which is that I put my money in my bank account and you put your money in the bank account, which means the banks were flooded with more liquidity. They had a lot more cash to go around and play with, right, and be able to give more loans, which is why as a result, the interest rates for almost all the loans that I know of, including pre-existing loans that people had already taken, the interest rates dropped and the banks reduced the interest. So I had a car loan, and the interest rate for the car loan obviously was reduced post demonetization, because the banks are now flooded with liquidity. Now, if there's a logical reasoning, critical reasoning question on what are the consequences of demonetization, it would probably be difficult to say this is a necessary consequence, because I think it still depends on the discretion of the banks. It depends on the competitive environment and the free market economic structure. So it is because A bank and B bank and C bank, all of them had liquidity. And one of the banks probably decided, I can give loans at cheaper rates now, so why don't I start doing it? And obviously, all the other banks also decided, yeah, now that person's going to have a competitive advantage. So is it an inference that you can derive? Yes. But is it a conclusion? That's, I think that would still be in the gray area, because it is subject to the discretion of the banks. So if you had to choose this kind, and while it might seem obvious, and this is the kind of question that people would get confused or have a mistake in terms of the answer, because especially somebody who's more well-read also, because that person would automatically start connecting with life experience. अरे हुआ तो था, obviously सबका interest rate कम हुआ था, मैंने तो पढ़ा ही था, and मैं तो बहुत पढ़ाई करता हूँ, so I definitely know this is what happened. So is it a conclusion? Yes, but it's actually not a conclusion. There are other factors because of which it's happening. It's not that simply demonetization, or even demonetization plus an increase in liquidity with the banks. It's also free market economy. So if there's only one bank and that bank was flooded with liquidity, then it may not necessarily lead to a reduction in interest rates. So it's not a conclusion per se, because there are other factors. So this is the skill that you can, this is the approach that you can sort of apply to other areas, other areas meaning other kinds of questions like this, where you're trying to differentiate between what's an inference, what's a necessary conclusion, what is a possible conclusion, and so on and so forth. The moment there are other factors, it's not a guaranteed conclusion.
Yeah, I think one takeaway I had from what you just said is suspending your existing knowledge when you're attempting a logical reasoning question.
It's important.
They're really not testing you on the basis of how much you know about, let's say, COVID-19. They may give you completely wrong facts in that question set, but you still have to put focus on the paragraph that you've been given. So it's important to, I guess, separate your knowledge, right?
It is.
So
It is
how
definitely.
would you recommend people go about preparing for logical reasoning? Because, and I'll share my experience as well, but in your experience as a trainer and as an educator and someone who's cleared all these exams yourself, what have you found are some effective methods?
Well, I really think, I mean, at this stage, probably it's easier for me to say I can just start by practicing or looking at questions and so on. Now, I still think you should start by looking at questions, get a sense of what you're expected to do. Get a few questions wrong, maybe do 20 to 50 questions, maybe. This is what I mean is day one. Like, you start by looking at a few questions, get your questions wrong, then you'll probably be satisfied with some of the explanations. Some of the explanations you'll be dissatisfied with, and some of the explanations you'll be thinking, this is outrightly wrong. I just don't agree with it. And this is where I think at that stage, when you've already done 50, 100 odd questions, and you already have a classification, so whether you agree or disagree with a few questions, that means your brain's already functioning in a certain way. Then you go speak with the right kind of mentors, right, or right kind of teachers. So it may not necessarily be me. So in our institute also, it's Abhilasha ma'am, Abhilasha Swaroop takes up logical reasoning in terms of critical reasoning, and Ashutosh sir takes up mathematics and analytical reasoning. So, Abhilasha ma'am's critical reasoning classes, and I'm not saying she's the only one in the whole country who can assist you with it. I'm just saying, right? It's important that then you have the right kind of teacher. And when we're looking at right kind of teacher, I really want to make a point here that there is a clear distinction between somebody who might be, have a certain degree of command, fluency, and proficiency over the English language per se, but not have the same or even remotely similar proficiency or command over logical or critical reasoning per se, because those are, I understand the interchangeability because of the focus on language itself, but the skill set required after you go through understanding the question, where language helps, of course, but after that, the skill set required is very different from just knowing English. So, and that's where I think the real challenge in terms of students preparing with certain teachers comes around. In my experience, at least, a lot of times I've seen people choosing or believing that this person is probably going to say the right thing because that person is able to speak English in a certain way. And it's I don't know, this discussion probably is endless in terms of how much value we give to the colonial hangover that we live in. But
how much is English dictating our lives?
Yeah, it is, including right now, as you can notice. But while I'm not going deeply into the colonial hangover problems that we face, I'm just saying this is just purely academically. Also, please understand that yes, both the questions seem like they're English, but they're really not. In one, they're asking you grammar and the meaning of a word, which is the right preposition. Somebody simply reads enough English, they'll already figure out the answers to those. But logical reasoning requires additional understanding of how to approach and distinguish between something like inference and conclusion, which we talked about.
So what would you recommend? So I'll just share my experience preparing for logical reasoning. When I started out with taking mock tests, which is usually my first strategy when I start prepping, it's always to take a test first so that you know what your weak areas are and where you focus on. I completely bombed the logic section completely. Like, I was terrible at it. I maybe got 3 questions right because it was so hard for me to begin to think in that critical manner. I
Right.
would keep missing those critical reasoning questions. Analytical reasoning was easy because we used to do those Venn diagram type of questions, used to
Yes.
be really common.
Right.
But I just started practicing a whole ton because there was no other workaround. Like you would practice and then you would get it wrong. You'd look up the answer, then you'd go back, practice some more. So I just kept practicing because you can't really read logical reasoning, in my opinion. It's not
Yeah, you
something,
can't.
yeah, you can't
So,
study
which
it.
is why I said you have to practice a lot of questions, at least 50, 100 first, then look at the explanations, clear it in your head as to why you agree or disagree, then try to meet someone. Of course, someone who doesn't have access to another fellow person that you can speak with, yeah, then you're probably stuck and you have to trust the explanations that you're reading. Right. And so the problem with just reading explanations, and I'm not saying that's the wrong approach, it's just the problem is not reading explanations. The problem is these days, it's just the information age is going to bomb you with so many different people giving so many different answers, especially online, that which is why I just made that point about knowing whose answer to trust, probably.
Mm.
I mean, of course, trust your answer above everyone else's, at least unless you're logically convinced otherwise. But in case you want to explore, it just becomes little challenging these days online for kids who are in 11th and 12th, because they just go to whatever forum, they're like 50 people answering, and well, 48 of them agree or 30 of them agree, out of which about 35 are students. So just access to resources is not a problem, but access to the right resource.
Correct
The
resources.
same problem that we face in law school when we're researching.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see all kinds of footnotes in people putting in articles and so on, and some of those footnotes are just absolutely useless. There's no point. Why do you think this article is worth quoting? So what if this author said that? Right. I mean, I understand if that author was also Supreme Court judge, uske baad usne legally India mein likha ho ya live law mein, doesn't make any difference.
Mm.
But some obscure journalist gave some opinion in Dainik Jagran, and then that becomes something that I think the ICJ should take cognizance. So that's not going to happen, because it's just not how
That's
the
not
world
how it
works.
works. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the kind of that's the kind of problem, I think, which law aspirants also face. So I
Due
don't know. I
respect
don't
to Dainik
know.
Jagaran,
I do respect Dainik Jagran, but
due respect.
I mean, why not? With due respect, of course.
Yeah.
I definitely respect this. So the newspaper itself is not the problem, but you start treating journalist opinion as legal opinion, somebody who's
Yeah.
not legally trained also,
Right.
that
That is the
problem is
challenge.
real. Yeah, or
Mm.
like English faculty talking about critical reasoning answers, the same
Yeah,
problem.
it's the
That's what I'm
same.
talking about.
Right. So I think finding good material and good explanations is a good way to
Yes,
go forward.
yes,
So
definitely.
um, I'm going to ask, somebody posted a question about, well, they posted it in context of legal reasoning, which we'll come to in a minute, but they're asking for recommendations for reference books.
So I think, again, pretty much all the previous material that most people would have had, including the various law prep tutorials like ours, like Legal Sapiens used to have, has, I think, it continues to be relevant only for non-CLAT examinations now. And that too, also, I think it's going to be a temporary hang around, because all the others would compulsively have to change the pattern to the CLAT model, because CLAT is obviously, it's already more than 20 law schools. So why would NLU Delhi continue to stick stubbornly to a different pattern, or even symbiosis, or Jindal doesn't really have a legal section. But all the others, I think they will have to modify it simply out of peer pressure, if nothing else. Now they haven't done it this year, right? So in this particular year, you still have to look at the past kind of questions. If you're looking at symbiosis, or you're looking at GLC ILS, the Maharashtra CET, or the NLU Delhi paper. But for the purpose of the CLAT, what material do you have to look at? I think the patterns changed so dramatically that there's no principal fact questions anymore. Excuse
Pattern
me.
changes almost every year, for that matter.
Yeah, but this is a major revamp. So it's the pattern would usually, earlier the kind of changes that we had was, there's going to be focus on this area a little more, or gradually they've reduced the focus on static GK and have almost dragged it to zero. That's one thing. But now there's not even a single principal fact-based question in the first place. And now, so therefore now something like how we used to have the requirement of reading as much law as possible and hope that you, like I always give the example that in the 2006 paper, that time there was still subjective section.
Right.
So one of the short notes in the NLS paper was on Hawala, right? And the moment I saw that question, it was due to sheer coincidence that I knew the answer. I was staying with a friend of mine in Calcutta for the last couple of weeks before the examination, and his father's a banker, and we were just over dinner one day talking about that time the stamp scam of Abdul
The
Teli had
Hawala
happened.
scam.
Yeah, so it was there on the newspapers and everything, but it's not something that was taught otherwise in tutorials. It was not something that as a layperson in 12th class I would have been able to make sense out of. But
Absolutely.
because somebody who sat down and explained to me and understood it in depth with in-depth knowledge, the moment I saw that short note, I knew I'm going to get like extremely good marks on that question, right? And I also knew a lot of people who are in the top 300 or 500 ranks. That's where the real competition is in terms of if you want to go to NLS at least.
Yeah.
Are going to screw it up. That's at least 1.5 marks extra I'm going to get on that particular question. So imagine the smile on my face before I started writing down that answer. What I'm trying to get at is that the reading comprehension questions in the legal section now is going to be like that in the sense, not luck dependency per se, but what I mean is now there's going to be probably an entire passage on Epidemic Diseases Act or Disaster Management Act or even the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and which would earlier not be possible. Even with Corona crisis, they would probably have one question on the Epidemic Diseases Act, but now an entire passage means there's going to be 5 to 6 questions at least on that one topic. So if you have, say, on an average 6 to 7 questions per passage and about 6 to 7 passages, right? And somehow there are 2, 3 really obscure passages which a lot of people might have ignored, but you read, then yeah, you're done. I mean, you probably sail through. So the wider preparation is not as important as I think focused preparation on everything that you are reading. So there's no, what should I put, cursory reading of anything is going to be absolutely useless because you're still going to get 1 out of 6 marks. Whatever you
Correct.
read in as much detail as possible, which is not something I would have recommended last year. So last
So
year, if you've looked at Epidemic Diseases Act, you could have just looked at the fact that this is in 1897, which is the year there is punishment and who has the power. That's something cursory would be enough. But now, if you're reading the DM Act or the Diseases Act, you have to read it in a lot more detail. Which exact authority has the power at district level or even at state level, and so on and so forth.
yeah, so when I was taking a look at the sample questions for legal reasoning this year, I noticed
Yeah.
that there is a lot of overlap with how a logical reasoning brain would think
Yes.
in that
Yes.
context. Because what are you being able to infer from this passage? There are those questions as well. So in a
Yes.
sense, I think the overlap has increased between these two sections.
Yes, and GK, and with GK also, because now there's a lot of legal knowledge which might be required in the GK section,
Correct.
and there's a lot of GK which would be required in the legal section.
Yeah,
So
they've
as a
mixed it.
teacher also, right. So as a teacher also, now I think it's very difficult for a GK faculty to actually take a reasonable GK class without having legal knowledge, and it's practically impossible for a legal faculty to take a legal class without reading the newspapers carefully enough. It's just no point. I can go on ranting about Article 14 and 19 and 21, but they're just going to ask you completely different application of the same concept. So unless I'm reading newspapers separately and I behave like an 80-year-old professor in a law school who's just still teaching you Menaka Gandhi, it
We
just
all
doesn't
know
work.
those professors.
Yeah, we do. They're just not bothered to read what's happening now. No, and it's pointless. I'm ruining people's time right now if I'm not telling them how to apply the Menka Gandhi rule to a current situation, because that's the only thing they're going to ask from the 3 sample papers. You can pretty much derive at least that much.
So what skills are they looking for from the current pattern of legal reasoning, do
To
you
be
think?
to be honest, I have no idea. Just like I had no idea. So let me start. How should I answer this? When I used to give the entrance in 2005 and 6, like I was just telling everyone, they had a subjective section. Right now, in the NLS Bangalore paper in particular, they had a subjective section in legal also.
Mm.
Right. So, and that subjective section would they give you principle and facts, yes, but they would expect you to argue from both sides.
Right.
Now, that's a skill after 2006 to it's been 14 years later also. I think that's a skill which is relevant even when you are in law school and even beyond.
Mm.
And that's a skill which would be relevant even when I was at Amarchand, because it should be able to think from both sides, right? On the other hand, the objective section where they ask you a principal fact and expected you to come to one particular conclusion, and even if you're very well practiced and you know exactly out of ABCD which is the right answer, that's a skill you will have to unlearn when you are in law school, because God forbid if you're arguing from the other side, you're just going to give up and say, "Nahi, main to entrance mein dekha tha, ek hi correct answer hota hai."
Mm.
No, no. Obviously, if Jethmalal is on the other side, he's going to be able to argue something, right? So it's so I don't know what they were testing for the last half a decade or decade also when the CLAT was happening. Now, what are they testing to be probably try to be kinder to the professors who've decided this? I think what they're trying to test is if somebody is just able to think in a logical manner in the legal section as well. So it's not that you need to know, because they're not asking you questions about on what decided case laws are, etc., etc.
Right.
But they are asking you. So when you read about the law, how conversant are you with legal language maybe, or your ability to interpret and understand, which is what they've been saying for the last 2 decades. I don't know if they'll be able to achieve it this time also. I don't know if there's a real way to achieve it actually also, unless you actually reach law school and start competing with trying to get an article published in a top level journal or participate in a top level moot court, go
Yeah.
head to head and toe to toe with your real competitors. By looking at a question paper and saying one correct answer or not, I don't know if it's a conclusive test in the first place, but it's okay. That's what they're trying to do, I think.
Yeah. So I think it would be very safe to say that reading the newspaper is pretty much the step one for GK, the step one for legal, even the step one for logical if you want to improve your reading speed, the step one for the English section. I think apart from the
Yes.
maths section, you can lift a lot of things from the newspaper.
Absolutely, which is what I think I've been saying, which by and large true for the last many years also. Although the focus on it's a little more enhanced now. So now I think it's safe to say, if you don't read newspapers, you might as well not give it a good shot, because you're anyway unlikely to, highly unlikely to be able to qualify the paper compared to someone who's going to be reading. And 2,000 people at least out of 75,000 are definitely going to read newspapers. So if you think you can beat them without reading the newspaper, that's not going to happen. That's just not going to happen.
Right. So in that setup, I'm just curious to ask you, what would you suggest is a good time management strategy for these two sections, especially because they're quite heavy on the reading side with critical reasoning, with legal reasoning, both those sections.
So I think because there's an increase in the per question time that you have overall, because they're still sticking to the 2 hour timeline, except you have 150 questions unlike
Correct.
200. So which means earlier you had about 32 to 34 seconds say per question. You can probably take a little more time now. Now, even earlier, I would still think that for the legal reasoning questions, you had approximately 45 seconds to 1 minute per question. So the top line for how long you should take for the legal section is still, I think, 1 minute to a maximum of 1 minute 10 seconds per question. 1 minute 10 seconds actually still going to be a little on the high side, so you'll have to make it up on somewhere else. But yeah, not more than 60 to 70 seconds per question in legal, as well as the same time frame that you need to follow for the logical reasoning questions. Now, of course, if you're good at maths, you can probably save a little time in the analytical reasoning section. and dedicate your time here. And if you're really good at English, then you can probably save a little time here and adjust that time in the other areas. But one way or the other, it should not be more than 70-75 seconds per question, because that's too slow otherwise. You're still not going to be able to make it. And sorry, just to add on, reading comprehension, when you look at it, it seems long, but after you're done with one RC, you have 6-7 questions also. So it's not that you have to read the entire RC in 70 seconds. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have more than 7 minutes to wrap up the entire RC. Right. So take your time to 3 minutes to read the RC, and then again 3 to 4 minutes to read the RC, and about 30 to whatever 25 to 30 seconds per question after that, because you're already done reading the reading comprehension.
Right. I also recommend practicing as many reading comprehensions as possible, because the more you practice, the more your speed increases when you're training. And that's very critical, I feel. So let's say somebody woke up yesterday morning and decided कि उनको lawyer बनना. Now they want to be a lawyer. How would you suggest their strategy should be, given that with all the uncertainty, let's say July or June or whenever they're planning to hold the exam, 21st June, I think, was the last notification.
Yes.
So what should you do if you have this time period that's a month and 10 days or 5 days?
So if you actually have just a month and 10 days, it's still doable. But I think a couple of reality checks that you should have with yourself. So and have that honest conversation with yourself. Ask yourself that, have I actually been reading newspapers? Not for the purpose of the CLAT, because I didn't want to be a lawyer before yesterday, but was I already reading newspapers? Am I actually good and decent at English? You have to really be very clear that that the approach to this has to be very different from board exams, right? And I know a lot of people who are obviously awesome at board exams and then do awesomely well, but that's not because that's not because the paper works similarly. It's just that people who did awesomely well at board exams were already sincere students, and then by default they just sincerely studied for a competitive exam. But the difference in approach is that you can sit and get 95% and you can sit and get 90%, and depending on what your own thresholds are and what your family's expectations are, you can still be happy about it. But the evaluation here is not whether you get 90 or 95, it's whether you got more marks than others, right? So when you're asking yourself these simple questions about, have I been reading newspapers, always imagine the entire country hunting you down and competing with you, and then ask yourself again, and now do I still think I've been reading newspapers enough? Or so I'm good at English because like I speak better than my cousins may not be good enough, because you have to think of all of the rest of the people. And those of you who are watching this video, you're already seeing how well Padmini speaks. And so imagine somebody like her also sitting in Guwahati, and somebody like me from Rourkela, which is an obscure city, which you may not have heard of. And there's going to be people from there also who are reading newspapers, studying hard, and so on and so forth. So if you still believe that, yes, reading habit to mera tha, kuch to main padhai karta hi tha, GK bhi mera theek thak hai, then you just need to put your head down and start attacking the sections that you may not be proficient with, like logical reasoning or legal reasoning, which would be new for you. So, and then month and a half is actually a good and decent enough time to be able to do it. Right? But I have bad English, I'm bad at GK, I don't read newspapers, maths is not something I like, which is why I want to do law. Yeah, but then you're going to not be able to do it in 1.5 months. Then you probably need a longer period of time. You can still do it, just may not be in 1.5 months. Not trying to discourage anyone. It's better you hear it from me now than the country reminding you with the CLAT result.
That's both terrifying and a much needed reality check, I feel. I'm getting scared because it's just reminding me of my CLAT years.
I'm sure.
It's been very interesting hearing your perspectives on how to prepare for this, because eventually logical reasoning ended up becoming one of my strongest sections, actually, because I just practiced and practiced and practiced. And by the time the exam came around, I think that year they had 45 questions on logical reasoning, and I got 43 right, and I knew I got 2 wrong. So walking out of the exam, I was like, yeah, these 2 I didn't get right, and that was absolutely what came to be. So it's entirely doable. as
I don't think
individuals.
anybody is going to believe that you had any section bad after you got 173, but okay, I'll just believe whatever you say.
But it was, I mean, yeah, on one, I think, encouraging note, you said you're from Rourkela, I'm from Guwahati. Increasingly, a lot of people, earlier law schools used to be this elitist sort of institution, still is
Yes,
in many ways, where
yes,
mostly city going kids would make it, but
yes,
that pattern is changing. So even if you don't have access to, let's say, the world's best facilities from Bangalore, Bombay, Delhi, or cities like that, Calcutta, I think it's
yeah,
still doable. So,
very much.
you know,
Very much. And I think it's also important that especially people from non-big cities don't I'm not saying you intentionally misrepresent to yourself, but don't start with that feeling that, oh, there's not enough people in my school who speak this, or there's not. I look at this stand-up comedies shows, or I'm looking at this good-looking rich people crowd in those shows, or I'm watching some sitcom and I'm thinking, God, none of my friends talks like this, and I don't talk like this. Am I even going to? That's a cultural, whatever culture shock problem that you can manage once you reach NLS Bangalore. I'm not saying you won't face it; you probably face it, but that's okay. Right now, the focus shouldn't be on what's the culture in NLS. Right now, your focus should be on your ability to get inside the gates. Figure out the culture once you reach there.
yeah, and diversity is always a good thing. So
Of course,
the more people come in from different parts of the country, I think the better it is. So maybe
yes,
we'll spend 10 minutes on people's questions.
sure.
Somebody asked, could you please explain the reforms in the labor laws recently undertaken by the governments of UP and MP? Very contentious straight off the bat. How could a
Okay,
question be formed vis-a-vis the CLAT?
okay. So there's just a few labor laws that have been that's it's not conclusively notified yet. First of all,
Yeah, it hasn't been.
um, but the proposal is that they're going to dilute a lot of labor laws to help small scale. So that's why there's no execution yet, because I don't think they're going to exempt big corporates from it. But small enterprises, now they've changed the definition of micro enterprise also. If you've looked at Nirmala Sitharaman's presentation, and up to 1 crore is now a micro enterprise also. So micro and small, medium, and those categories. So I don't know who they're going to do it for, but again, it's just so contentious. But let me just say it. I believe that for really small and micro enterprises, it actually makes sense to suspend some of the labor laws, because they may not. It's just it helps nobody if they go bankrupt in the first place. Now, big corporates, and this is not a Republican or ultra capitalist philosophy that I'm trying to impose on anyone. I agree that I don't think Ambani or somebody who can afford it, even out of their whatever corporate net worth, should be allowed to do it. Right? I don't think Tirupati Temple, for example, should be able to say we can't pay our I don't know. The trust has already come out with something that they can't pay this much labor and that much labor. Yeah, you dig into your monetary fund and you can pay. Please don't tell us you can't pay. So anybody who can, I understand, but you have to understand that there's a lot of people who actually can't. They're on the verge of bankruptcy. May not be Uber, but there's definitely like a small travel agency in uh, Rourkela or Guwahati or even Lucknow or Delhi or Bombay, who's definitely looking at bankruptcy right now, or on the verge of it. Now, if you force that person to keep complying with 10 other laws, which I'm not saying it's per se wrong, yes, this is for the benefit of labor and so on, but the labor also loses their job. The other factor, because the company goes bankrupt, everybody loses their job, right? So the second reason why this, in certain contexts, like really small companies, makes sense is if you don't do this and you allow the employer therefore to anyway negotiate, because free market economy is not going to die. So what's going to happen is the employer is anyway going to negotiate 10 other deals with their workers. So what would continue is probably the PF deductions that used to happen, but there's going to be a heavy pay cut. There's going to be delayed salaries. There's going to be 10 other things which the law can't directly regulate anyway. So by giving relaxations on a very futuristic benefit that people are eligible to, like gratuity payments or PF withdrawals, which is anyway going to happen 15 years later, right? So you can reimpose it when the economy, if and when it revives. But till that time, I guess it makes sense to between allowing the employer to start suffocating employees in other ways, which they are, by the way, free to do. No, I'm not going to fire you and give you the pink slip. I can suspension or pay cut and no bonus this year. All of these things, and by the way, all of these things are already happening. It's not that they're not. Maybe there'll be a little respite if these kind of benefits are extended. The counter side or the flip side of it is pretty obvious, which I'm not going to. I don't. There's not much to discuss there. Even after giving all of these benefits, employers might still go and abuse their employees, right? So the counter side is just self-explanatory.
And it violates international norms set down by the International Labour Organization. If you, especially with the increase in the hours that have been implemented. But if they were going to put this from a CLAT perspective, I would say that maybe they'll give you a huge passage or an editorial and sort of draw questions from there. So what kind of questions do you think they might ask about the labor laws themselves that are state specific, or how do you think this might go?
No, I don't think they're going to ask you state specific laws. Although, I mean, as a corporate lawyer, I can tell you that what a lot of laws which seem state specific are actually not state specific. Like, for example, the Shops and Establishment Act. So of course, all of states have their own Shops and Establishment Acts, but it's like the Indian Penal Code, because UP IPC is different from Andhra Pradesh and Assam IPC. But it's, I mean, most of the sections are so common that that's why we need it together, right? So, which is for all those people who are preparing for the law exam, please note it down, and you should remember it anyway. IPC is not a central law. IPC is actually implemented state-wise, and every state has. इसीलिए IPC खोल के देखोगे तो बहुत सारी जगह पे you'll find state amendment. That's because every state has a law and order is a state subject under the constitution. So similarly, a lot of these labor laws are actually quite uniform, even when they are state specific. So Shops and Establishment Act is the one I gave you that example because you talked about the hours of work. So that's the law which puts a cap on 8 hours per week and a maximum of 48 hours in a week, and per day 8 hours and so on. So I don't think they're going to suspend that. Again, this is all hypothetical because we don't know what they're going to suspend yet. Even if they suspend it, it's just a proposal. And like I said, I think at best they're just going to take out some of the, I don't think they're going to force labor type ka alag se nahi jayega.
We'll see.
We can probably have this discussion, when they actually come out with something concrete. Now it's just too hypothetical right now. There's two people saying we're going to suspend labor laws. Everybody and their uncle knows they're not going to suspend all labor laws. That makes no sense. It will be constitutionally challenged and it will be declared to be void. That's not going to happen. They're going to do something more structural than that. So and since I have no idea, wait and watch.
Yeah, wait and watch from a CLAT perspective. Wait and watch and see what happens, and probably keep up to date with the news so that when you see the passage,
actual change,
when the passage comes in the examination, you're not flabbergasted ke kahan se aa gaya ye question.
Yes, correct.
All right, we'll go to the next question. What are some, please recommend reference books other than Arihant, because we don't have the source to such type of questions in legal maxims and torts. So what are some good sources for legal maxims and torts?
Legal maxim and torts. So first of all, I don't know how much focus on tort law is going to continue now. I think it's going to be diluted to a very large extent, especially for the limited purpose of the CLAT examination. Although I think the focus on other torts on other examinations will probably continue. So when you're reading any old material, which is something I already dealt with, I think that if you're looking at old material for the purpose of other exams, it's perfectly fine and you feel free to continue doing that. For the purpose of the new pattern of the CLAT examination, you'll have to, I don't know how much free material, I don't think adequate free material is available as of yet.
We'll be creating a plugging project Maverick. We'll be creating a whole set of free materials in the coming weeks.
So there you go.
So please tune in and join our Facebook group. I'm going to post the link.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, not at all. I think I was pretty much, that's what I was saying, that, I don't think there's enough free material available on the new pattern. Although of course a lot of preparatory institutes, including ourselves, so we conduct a mock every week, for example. So that's at least 35 plus questions in the legal section, and whatever 150 questions a week is definitely happening overall. And so because this whole lockdown thing happened in and around the crash course, where the schedule was already packed and we had to do a mock every week, somehow we're just also in the crash course hangover, even though it's now extended to more than three months or so.
Yeah.
So, but it's okay. Because of the new pattern, I think it's okay to continue with a mock every week now. At our end, because just like I said, there's just not enough free material available for everyone to keep on endlessly practicing.
That's correct. And the sample questions are simply not enough in their breadth and scope for you to absolutely rely on that. I get that.
Yes.
All right, we have another question. Somebody said join Legal Sapiens promo.
Okay.
Somebody said,
which was that kind and generous person?
His name is Abhishek Dubey, and he's been very enthusiastic about your talk right from the outset.
That's very sweet.
Then somebody said, please suggest good books for preparing for the CLAT examination.
I think we've already covered that too.
Yeah. There's a whole range. I remember and I'm not recommending this necessarily for everyone, but for logical reasoning, I really couldn't find enough material, and all the SAT prep stuff was a little bit off key. So I used to, for critical reasoning, I just went with mock tests, but for analytical reasoning, I got this. Yeah, okay, I didn't know about the GMAT at the time, but for analytical reasoning, I found this copy of R.S. Agarwal's analytical reasoning, and it had all the questions. So that that was helpful at my time. I don't know what the logic section looks like now, but
no, it's still helpful. It's still helpful. Anybody who wants to buy it, again, I'm not recommending it, but it's definitely a helpful book. So, but I think a lot of people are already involved with already preparing one place or the other. So if you're already involved, then go speak with the relevant people. If not, then yes, R.S. Agarwal is definitely a helpful book.
Yeah.
Even today.
Our coaching facilities in Guwahati weren't that great. So we were a bit reliant on whatever
I'm sure it was better than Rourkela.
Close. Somebody's asked, how important are logical reasoning and aptitude for judicial exams after law school? Yeah.
I don't think they're not part of the syllabus. Other areas like GK per se is obviously continuing to be important, but I don't think they ask you logical reasoning questions in judiciary exams, if that's the particular context of the question.
Yeah, judiciary exams.
Yeah, so judiciary, I don't think they ask you logical reasoning questions. Although if you give UPSC, of course, there's a minimum cutoff that you need to score in the prelims examination, which is the CSAT paper. They don't add the marks anymore, which I think is very unfortunate, because initially, so in 2013, I think they 12 they announced it, 13 they did the CSAT where they included the marks, and then the IITians and the law school and the medical people just completely, I think, murdered the paper by getting about 180 type scores throughout, like for the CSAT. So then people took to the streets, ki nahi, ye galat hai. Hum kya karenge to fir? I'm like, this is kya karo, kya practice karo? Bata to rahe. How complicated can it honestly be?
As it is, the examination is fairly, like all examinations, it's fairly elitist in any way. So
yeah, that's true.
What can you do? But yeah, a lot of lawyers do go on to become extremely excellent civil servants. Sorry, a lot of law students do go on to become extremely excellent civil servants. So that's always an open career option for any of you who's thinking. So I think that wraps up our session. Unless you have any last comments you have for us, or are there any more questions? You can drop in your questions below if anyone has any questions. It's a golden opportunity to talk to somebody who's been in the training industry for a really long time.
It's a golden opportunity to talk to Padmini also, for those of you who want to find out. A lot more recent than me in any case.
Still highly old. But I think it's quite important to promote more content and better training resources for people to be able to access the CLAT examination effectively.
Yes.
Somebody asked how to manage time. I think we've covered that already in our discussion.
We've covered two sections. We definitely touched upon. I thought it was 60 to 70 seconds per, on an average, per per logical and legal reasoning question. But for GK, again, unlike previous times, I think it will take you a little longer for you to be able to do the GK questions now compared to earlier, because earlier I think you could easily do 4 to 5 questions per minute. Now with the whole RC burden, I think that's the one area where it's definitely going to take you a little more time, because you still have to fish for the answer, if nothing else.
Correct.
So if they fill in the blanks bhi hota hai, to kahan pe blank hai, kam se kam kuch to there still has to be a double check on it. So it's not going to be 4 questions or 5 questions per minute. I think it's going to be about 2 questions per minute now. So you're going to miss out on a little bit of time there, but that's okay. That's why you have 30 minutes extra in any case.
Yeah.
I mean, compared 50 questions reduced hone ke baad bhi 2 hours is what I mean.
Yeah, it was our year was quite a time constrained paper. I think everyone really rushed through that. All right. I think this was an extremely productive discussion. If you have any more questions, you can always write into me at this email address. I'm just going to drop my ID. Give us feedback on what kind of webinars you'd like us to host. If you have any particular speakers you want to invite, if you have questions for Debajyoti sir, you can drop those at the email. Please join our Facebook group, and thanks so much for joining us.
You can directly connect to me on Facebook also. That's not a problem. I mean, my phone number is also freely available. So there's 2 Facebook places that I am at. There's of course Legal Sapiens, but also I have a Facebook account like everyone, and I have a Facebook page which is actually more politically opinionated. It's a BJP kind of a page. So if you were feeling a little buck-like or feeling right-wing, then there's about 25,000 followers plus on that page also. So feel free to jump in there. But otherwise, like I said, my phone number, etc., is also freely available, or you can drop in a mail to the address that Padmini just dropped by.
So fascinating. I'm on the other side of the spectrum. We should have a conversation.
Absolutely. Do let me know.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at more of our webinars in the future. Thank you, Debajyoti. This was great.
Thank you, Padmini. Thank you for having me.